Good afternoon, and welcome to Legal Lunch with Laura. We are pleased that we have a large group participating in this webinar today. Today's webinar topic is Understanding the Disruptive Professional in the Workplace. Dr. Michael Haidt and I will discuss alternatives to termination. This webinar is also approved for 1 hour of continuing education credits for those of you who have your PHR, SPHR, and GPHR certifications. After this webinar, you will receive an email from me with the code to submit for your credits. This webinar is also being taped, and the recording and accompanying slides will be placed on Asa Kerman's website for your future access at any time. If during the webinar you have a question, feel free to type it into the question box on the right side of the screen. We will answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. Our presentation will last 1 hour, and the purpose is for you to gain an understanding into the psychology behind a disruptive professional and also a legal perspective about what rights and options companies have when addressing disruptive professionals. There are many complicating factors, as Dr. Haidt will discuss in just a moment. I invite you to join me for future Legal Lunch with Laura webinars in 2012. The next one is Tuesday, September 18th. And following that, the last one for 2012 will be Tuesday, November 20th. Announcements will be forthcoming via email. Now let me introduce you to Dr. Michael Haidt. Dr. Haidt is a licensed psychologist with extensive experience and expertise in working with physicians, lawyers, psychologists, executives, and other professionals who are dealing with personal and work-related challenges. He is also a psychological consultant to small and mid-sized companies on a variety of workplace and organizational issues. Dr. Haidt is on the faculty of the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, the Johns Hopkins University School of Education, and Loyola University, Maryland. Dr. Haidt has worked in a variety of settings, including employee assistance programs, or as you know them as EAPs, inpatient psychiatric hospitals, outpatient mental health centers, emergency departments, and not-for-profit organizations. I heard Dr. Haidt make a presentation a few years ago and found him to be both entertaining and informative. I've also had an opportunity to refer to Dr. Haidt, a disruptive professional, with whom Dr. Haidt met for several months. The company was quite pleased with the results. Welcome, Dr. Haidt, and thank you for joining us for this webinar today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So let's jump right in. What is a disruptive professional? A disruptive person can have many faces in the workplace, and many of you have encountered him or her in your current or past company. This person can be the constant jokester who often makes crude, off-color, inappropriate jokes or comments, perhaps the sexual predator who makes others feel uncomfortable with compliments, come-ons, unwanted touching, flirting, hugs, gifts, or undue pressure for dates, the constant offender who makes discriminatory statements about every nationality, accent, religion, age group, or person with a disability, and finally, perhaps the bully, the angry, unapproachable boss who everyone fears. This person is belittling, loud, and steals self-esteem of his or her subordinates. So, Dr. Haidt, how would you describe the disruptive professional?
Well, I think you did a good job of giving some great examples of some disruptive folks. When I think of disruptive behavior, I like to think of it kind of comparing it to beauty, which lies in the eye of the beholder. It's important to think about who is this disruptive person, who is the person disruptive to. Is the professional disruptive to their coworkers, to their customers, to others in the profession? Is the person, it's similar to sexual harassment or hostile work environments, though, as you know better than I, the laws are not quite in place for this type of thing, looking at disruptive behavior. Though, as you mentioned before, a lot of the work that I do is with disruptive physicians, and I'm sure that'll come out in our talk today. The Joint Commission, which is the body that accredits hospitals, they have adopted some definitions of disruptive behavior that I found to be very useful in my work with people. But you'll see that it's unlike, I'm sorry, similar to sexual harassment. It's oftentimes difficult to define exactly what it is that we're talking about, and perhaps better to deal with examples. One last thing I'll just say about this is that there's, as I say here, the vulnerability of the hierarchical corporate model. Basically, that the higher you up in a corporation, the greater the implications are of your disruptive behavior. Or the person's disruptive behavior. Oftentimes, the lower on the organizational chart, the more it's able to be tolerated sometimes.
What do you mean by that? So you're saying, say, a new hire salesperson who is disruptive in the workplace.
Right.
You say it's more tolerated or less tolerated?
Well, it depends. It depends on how valued the person is, and that's something that's going to come out today, during our talk, is that oftentimes the folks who are very valued, their disruptive behavior is tolerated. I guess perhaps a better way of saying it is as the slide says, is that the implications are greater when the behavior is tolerated for the person higher up in the organizational chart. That they are, the risk of lawsuits are greater, the threat to morale can be greater than somebody lower in the corporate chain. So some examples, because again, I said that it would probably be easier to talk about examples. Some common presentations that I've seen over the years. So one category is interpersonal relationships. So folks who are having trouble interacting with others, either because there's a skill deficiency, that they just lack social skills, or because there's a problem with their communications, they send emails or texts that are hostile, that are difficult, or that could even be threatening. So folks who are intimidating, who are threatening, or even get into physical contact with other people, that could fall under this category of interpersonal relations. Another category is self-sabotage, or in my field, in the field of psychology, we'd call success neurosis. And that's where people perhaps are the workaholics, the folks who don't have a good work-life balance. And if something goes wrong in their career, if they have a minor failure in their career, but all their eggs are in one basket, it can really derail the professional. Another category is boundary crossings or boundary violations. So folks who perhaps feel more comfortable with you than you are with them would be an example of that. Joking that becomes uncomfortable, harassing, or sexually harassing, it would be another example of that. Some more categories. So performance problems. So when people become disruptive because of their negligence, because they're committing repeated errors without attempts to correct, their productivity dips. That's another form of disruption. Systems mismatch. So if you think of the fish out of water, you can have, so for example, I did a lot of my work, I worked for about a decade in the employee assistance program at Johns Hopkins, and what we'd see sometimes are really, really talented, warm, great physicians who are just great at being doctors. But Hopkins, as you know, is a research, it's an academic medical center. It's not a community hospital. And so a wonderful physician will do wonderfully at a community hospital. They might not do wonderfully at an academic medical center because they're not doing teaching, or they're not doing, they're not great at research. And so that can affect their productivity, that can affect how they're interacting with others. Of course, people who have trouble leading others, one way of measuring that, of course, is with staff turnover. Everyone's heard of the manager who's great at what he or she does, but she just can't hold on to employees. Just constantly going through secretaries, or constantly going through associates. People come and they go, and that can be very disruptive to an organization. And of course, if there are complaints from patients or customers or grievances within the organization, that would be another measure of disruptive behavior. And then the last category that I'd like to talk about is impairment. And so when I have here, Axis 1 and Axis 2 disorders, What that is the American Psychiatric Association has a list of all the diagnoses, the psychiatric diagnoses. They break it down into Axis 1 and Axis 2, and then V codes. Axis 1 are the major clinical syndromes. So those are the depression, schizophrenia, obsessive-compulsive disorders, things like that. Axis 2 are personality disorders. I could give an hour-long talk about personality disorders, but I'll tell you that I hate the term personality disorder because it sounds like we're talking about a bad person, someone who's just got a bad personality. And that's not what a personality disorder is, according to the APA. It's when it's a long-term, pervasive, and enduring pattern of perceiving, interacting with, and interpreting your environment. So if you think about that, that's how you see the world. That's how you interact with the world. And there are ways where that can be dysfunctional. So what I see most of associated with disruptive behavior on Axis 1, those major clinical syndromes, are mood disorders like depression or bipolar disorder. So someone who might have hypomania, which is kind of a lower form of bipolar disorder. They're biting off more than they can chew. They're not sleeping at night, and they're speaking a mile a minute, speaking faster than I am right now, perhaps. Folks with substance abuse disorders or substance-related disorders, and again, what I see most of, and I'm not a specialist with substance abuse, but what I see primarily is alcohol-related problems and opioid problems. Opioid meaning heroin, but usually oxycodone and the prescription medicines. Sexual paraphilias. So this is folks who are in quotes, addicted to pornography, exhibitionism, so they're exposing themselves in public. There was a case from years ago where a high-level professional brought in an IT professional and said, "Oh, I've got problems with my computer. Can you take a look at this?" And you hit the space bar, and the screensaver goes away, or the blank screen goes away, and there's pornography. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of a form of exhibitionism as well. Frauderism is just a really nice word. It makes me sound smart, I think, when I use it. So frauderism is folks who become sexually aroused when they rub up against other people in public. Again, not a very common thing, but think about if that happens in the workplace, there are going to be a lot of complaints about this.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, there's cognitive disorders. So dementia. So someone who's cognitively sliding, their memory's slipping, that sort of thing. TBIs are traumatic brain injuries, and that's a person who's gotten into a car accident a couple weeks ago, and they're just not quite the same, as well as someone who's maybe returning from overseas in the military, was exposed to blasts, things like that, and now they're having trouble with impulse control, modulating their emotions. On Axis 2, those personality disorders, they're broken into clusters, which really isn't all that relevant to our talk here, but what I see a lot of is either diagnosable or what I call subclinical compulsive personality disorder. The actual term is OCPD, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, but it's different than the was it Jack Nicholson in that movie As Good as It Gets? Mm-hmm. Not that type of OCD. This is more of kind of me. I like things very orderly. I like things very neat and tidy. When they're out of order, I get disorganized. And I might even be, when I come home, and my home is really messy because my kids are running around, I can feel tension, in my body. Mm-hmm. I like to think of myself as being non-pathological in this. We can talk to my wife about this, perhaps. But that type of, so that compulsivity, I see a lot of the compulsive personality, and the perfectionism, where someone's just not, their colleagues aren't living up to their standards, and so they yell at them or they belittle them, things like that. Of course, we can think of the person who's narcissistic or antisocial, and antisocial meaning the more sociopath rather than the shy person. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, someone who's paranoid is likely to be wondering what's going on around them, thinking that people are talking about them, whether they are or not, and be acting strangely as a result. And then the non-psychiatric disorders that still can be clinically important in my work with people. Could be issues like relationship problems. So when someone's going through a divorce at home, oftentimes it bleeds through at work. Or if someone has lost a significant other to death, that can surely affect one's work in the workplace.
I have a question for you. I know you can't tell us about your patients or the consulting you do with clients, but can you give us a sense of the types of cases you've worked with, or maybe even the types of cases you like to work with?
Sure. As I mentioned, the compulsive personality disorder, maybe it's that I see a bit of myself in them. I'm not quite sure. But I think that working, again, I'm seeing a lot of that, particularly in my physicians that are referred to me. But also in the attorneys and the accountants and other folks, other executives, that perfectionism, which can be very, very adaptive in 95% of their work, when it comes to interpersonal relationships, when it comes to working with teams, can really derail somebody professionally and can lead them towards a very disruptive behavior. So that's one example of a disruptive population that I enjoy working with, and I'm seeing quite a bit of.
Okay. I know we wanted to talk about this beautiful slide.
Thank you.
Talking about anger and how anger, that type of behavior can be disruptive in the workplace.
Sure. And so basically what we're looking at is on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, you'll see it says intensity, and so that's intensity of anger. And on the vertical axis, the y-axis, it's frequency. It's how often we're seeing displays of the anger. So at the bottom left, you'll see episodic irritation, and that's someone like my mom. So someone who, you could kick her in the shins and she'll say, oh, well, that's okay. As long, maybe it's good exercise for you. And she sees, the glass is half full, and, she really doesn't get angry often. So the frequency is low and the intensity of it is low. And as we go horizontally across, you'll see kind of the episodic anger. That's probably where most people fit. That's where people can be displeased episodically. It doesn't happen often, but every once in a while we see somebody who they get angry, but they don't really take it out on other people. And you go over another step, and you'll see someone who has episodic rage. So it's very intense anger that is more behavioral rather than just in my own head or how I'm feeling. So I'm taking it out on people, and the danger with that is that this is an unpredictable person. We don't know when it's going to happen because most of the time they're cool, calm, and collected.
Like the Hulk.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. like perhaps like the Hulk.
Right.
Now on the top you'll see the frequent complainer. So someone who's chronically irritated. They see the glass as being half empty or barely half empty at that. And they're always complaining about something. The intensity of their anger is very low. It's more just an irritant. You go over towards more intensity with high frequency, and we're looking at chronic anger. That's oftentimes who we're talking about here. So again, most people probably fall in other categories, particularly the episodic anger. But with the chronic anger, this is a person who is going to be getting on other people's nerves often, who are going to be upsetting people often. And then at the extreme is the chronic rage, the person who really is probably kind of dangerous. Luckily, I don't see much of this, and probably because people who engage in chronic, frequent, rageful episodes, they get fired. So we're probably not talking about these people today.
Great. Let's take a poll, and I'll ask all of you out there, what types of disruptive behaviors have you encountered in the workplace? And feel free to check any or all that apply. And so as not to disclose anything, this question can really be, what types of disruptive behavior have you encountered in your current or former workplace? Or maybe even a place where you have volunteered, a place where you are a member. Let's see, we are getting results now.
This is fun.
I know, this is one of my favorite parts, and it looks like most of you, almost 92% of you, the majority of you selected the first one. that you've encountered disruptive behavior based on folks who have maybe poor interpersonal communication problems, poor social skills. They've sent inappropriate emails, texts, jokes, or are harassing. The second highest response is the second answer, which is hostility, intimidation, threats, and violence. Then we go down to self-sabotage, poor leadership, and then substance abuse issues, which certainly can be very detrimental to the workplace.
And what's interesting to this is we set it up so that you can check all that apply. So we're seeing that about 90-some% have checked the interpersonal communication problems, and that there's probably a fair amount of overlap between perhaps the communications and the hostility category, let's say. But it is very interesting to see this. So the systems mismatches, it seems to be pretty infrequent, where that fish out of water is impairing someone's ability to work well with others.
So let's talk a little bit about the implications of the behaviors that you discussed.
Yep, actually we were just on the,
oh.
There you go, okay. Okay, so before I mentioned pretty quickly, I mentioned productivity. So obviously that's kind of the bottom line is are people being productive? Are they being efficient? That sort of thing. Oftentimes it's a result of communications breakdown. Sometimes what ends up happening is because if I were to be really disruptive, if I and Laura, you and I were working together, and I did something wrong. I wrote a memo wrong, or I wrote a prescription wrong, or whatever our industry was. You might be afraid to confront me and say, "Oh, Michael, I think that you did something wrong here," because I'd chew you out. I'd just yell at you because that's what I do.
Right.
And so oftentimes, particularly in the medical field, in the aviation field, this is a very significant concern, because if a nurse or if a fellow physician or another person in the OR or in the medical clinic is not willing to say, "Hey, doc, I think that you made a mistake here," that's patients' lives. So the implications are really great. Morale. So there can be job turnover, job dissatisfaction. It's difficult to retain good employees when the work environment is hostile. There are clearly financial implications. So there's obviously lawsuits that can affect things. As I said, staff turnover. What in the HR literature they say that it's about 1.5%, 1.5 of a person's annual salary is how much it costs to turn over that position, depending on their level.
Sure.
And that number goes up and down. So think about that. If somebody leaves because there's a disruptive boss or because there's a disruptive colleague, there's going to be decreased productivity from that person before they leave. They're going to leave. There's going to be no productivity from that person. Then you're going to have to expand energy, time, and money to recruit somebody new. And then once you get them in, they're going to not be productive for a while until they're finally up to snuff. And that can cost a company quite a bit of money. And then there's the issue of modeling, that if Bob down the hall is allowed to yell at people, well, you know what, I'm angry, I'm going to yell at people. And so there's kind of a contagion effect that, by norming this, by allowing it to happen, it then becomes an okay, permitted behavior in the workplace, which can really be difficult. Interestingly, as I mentioned before, I work with a lot of physicians. What we see, or what we've seen in the past, we're seeing a little bit less of it nicely now, is that residents who are physicians in training, they will observe, or they've observed the guys who have been around for years and years, who have gotten away with being kind of disruptive. They are then in a position of authority. They go in and they start yelling at the nurses, and the nurses write them up. And they wonder, well, how did I get in trouble from yelling at a nurse? I've got more power than a nurse, kind of thing.
Sure.
And, again, the Joint Commission, that accreditation body, has said, listen, everyone has to have an equal voice. Everyone has to be able to be heard. In fact, there are actual procedures now that require that before a surgery. They do a timeout procedure where everybody's voice in the OR is equal, the surgeon is not kind of the captain of the ship during that period of time. And this is to prevent those medical errors we talked about before, and it's also to change the modeling from one generation of professionals to the next.
It's interesting. Is the problem always the difficult professional, or can there be other factors at play?
There can definitely be many other factors at play. And so systemic forces, what I mean by that are, so some personal issues could be, kind of the type A personality, or a person who has the compulsive personality disorder I talked about before, or having relationship problems at home, or even good things. Having, the birth of a child. I mean, think about it. When your child's born, that's all you're thinking about. You're very distracted. You're sleep deprived like crazy. Yep, thanks for the laughter. And so that can definitely affect things. But there's also the kind of the climate of the corporation, of the office. Work demands. What's the schedule like? Is this a 9-to-5 type of job, or is this a until it gets done type of job? What's the volume of work that people are doing? And how are policies interpreted at this institution versus the institution I used to work at? Then you can also think about the industry. So not just the office that I work in, but the industry, this profession, this specialty. New technology can affect things. So, I was trained years ago and I didn't learn how to use this instrument. Well, so I'm behind the times, and that can create some pressure on me. Something that, again, much better than I do, just trends in litigation from industry to industry. And surely in medicine there's a fair amount of litigation, malpractice suits and things like that. And then you think more globally. You think about politics. You think about economics. So over the past few years, people have really had to rein themselves in, where, let's say back in the mid-2000s, in 2004 perhaps, when people weren't as desperate to maintain their job because they could get a new job, they perhaps could have been more disruptive then. And now they really have to be careful. They have to be cautious, because if you lose your job now, it might be difficult to find a new job. And then, of course, global economy and other factors that surely affect things.
It's interesting because I have noticed that when the economy was not so great, we were defending fewer EEOC charges.
Right.
And we thought that the reason being is because people were less inclined to file a complaint against a supervisor or file a complaint against a coworker, because they thought that could mean that would be the end of their job.
Right.
And they were afraid of those ramifications. So let's talk next about some intervention issues. And so intervention meaning, what do we do next? Okay, if it's come to the company's attention that there is a disruptive professional in the workplace, what do we do? First of all, as I say in all of my seminars and all of my webinars, make sure you document. Documentation is so important. The company also needs to have written policies and procedures to deal with these types of disruptive situations. Your handbook probably contains a progressive discipline policy. That policy typically says that discipline will be meted out incrementally to include, to start, for example, a verbal warning that is documented in the employee handbook, in the personnel file. Second would be a written warning that is also obviously documented in the employee personnel file. Next is suspension, sometimes with or without pay, depending upon the circumstances. And then finally, the last step in the progressive discipline progressive discipline model is termination. Of course, more egregious behaviors or major policy violations will mean immediate termination, and incremental steps can be skipped. Companies may also want to consider a PIP, a performance improvement plan, where employees are given a stern written warning that their behavior or performance needs to improve immediately, or else they will be terminated. So those types of documentation are very important.
And being the shrink that I am, I think that it's important to look at not just how are you going to be dealing with this employee, but being compassionate in the process, being collegial, and expressing the shared goals. Because after all, when you're doing this, you are investing in the employee. When you're, it's probably in some cases easier to just terminate somebody. But as we talked about before, when you terminate somebody, there's that, there's great expense associated with that. This is a nice investment in the employee, saying, listen, we will not tolerate this anymore. We'll talk about that in a moment. But we want to help you. Rather than just slapping them on the wrist and saying, stop, we're saying, we want to help you. So doing good, beneficence, doing good, and non-malfeasance, so not doing harm, I think is important to focus on. Being respectful, caring, and timely. One of the things that really bugs me is when I get a referral of someone who's been disruptive, and the documentation that I request, because I like to get as much collateral data as possible, the documentation that I collect says that, so it's July now. So in June they acted out, they did something, and in May of 2002 they yelled at somebody and did something, and that it needs to be timely. That they need to hear about when they're doing something immediately that is wrong, and that the intervention, meaning the investigation, the documentation, the progressive disciplinary action, all that needs to happen in a timely manner. And I think it's important to be focused on not just the corporation, but also be focused on the customer, the effects that this has, the intervention has on a customer, as well as on the person's career, the person's family, and on their health. Because this can be one of the most stressful things that a person deals with, the disruptive person deals with, being confronted and being called to task on this. And so I think it's important to keep all this in mind.
Absolutely, and I've had experiences where, and I know this is slightly off topic, but where someone is accused of, or I should say wrongfully accused of being a harasser. It takes a huge toll on that person with respect to their, their performance, with their self-esteem, with having to disclose a false accusation to family members, because this might be put out there in the media. Mm-hmm. This could be talked about by other coworkers where, let's say, you and your spouse are out to dinner and a colleague comes over and says, oh, gosh, sorry to hear about that, sexual harassment claim that, you've been accused of. Right. You need to disclose that. You may want to disclose that in advance to a spouse. Or maybe even some other colleagues, and it can be very embarrassing, even if it's not true.
Right.
So let's talk about due process. What is due process? And due process I consider to be part of the investigation, part of the intervention. Know your policies and apply or adapt your written policies to the situation at hand. For example, is there a code of conduct that addresses mutual respect among coworkers? Remind the parties that it needs to be followed at all times. The parties and witnesses who you are interviewing during the investigation should be assured that there will be no retaliation if they cooperate in the investigation, and that what they disclose to the investigator will be held in confidence to the extent possible. I am in the process of conducting an investigation for a client, and I had to tell the individuals who I was interviewing that this was a private conversation, but I couldn't protect confidentiality. Right. I had to report back to the powers that be at the company. So to be sure, if make sure you're telling me the truth, mm-hmm. but tell me. But understand that what you tell me could possibly be disclosed. Also, in the due process part of the intervention, I would suggest that if a party cannot be removed from, for example, the bully, the harasser, the disruptive professional, if that person cannot be temporarily taken out of the situation, mm-hmm. If they, are so valuable that they have to still be in the workplace, or there are several meetings they're running, or they're a department head, and so you can't suspend them at the time. It's important to explain to that professional, hey, listen, let's call a truce here while we conduct this investigation. We need your cooperation, and if we don't get it, there will be ramifications as far as that. And that brings us to, of course, zero tolerance. And as you'll see on the slide, and as Dr. Haidt mentioned earlier, zero tolerance does not necessarily mean termination. Zero tolerance does not mean automatic termination if a rule is violated. It just means that the company will immediately address the issue and assure that measures are taken so that inappropriate behaviors will not be repeated. Often that can mean immediate termination, and again, as Dr. Haidt mentioned earlier, depends upon where the individual falls within the hierarchy of the business. You will see zero tolerance applied if it is a relatively new employee, if it is a lower level, perhaps hourly worker, or again, if the behavior is very egregious. Unfortunately, in situations where there is, a physical assault or something like that, certainly zero tolerance could not be terminated. However, for the owner, say the owner of a medical practice, or the CFO who has built the company and worked there for 35 years, termination may not be an option, and more creative but effective options need to be considered.
And one thing I'll add to that is just, before you mentioned the performance improvement plans, that when somebody has when the disruptive professional is under a performance improvement plan, that doesn't protect them from continued behavior. And so if someone is told you can't act in this way, or you can't send emails that are threatening, or you can't do whatever it is that was being disruptive, we're looking at you for the next 6 months, and here's other thing, you got to go see a coach or a counselor or something like that to deal with this issue, and we're going to be monitoring this for 6 months. This is part of your performance improvement plan, blah, blah, blah. If the person continues to engage in that behavior, they're not protected from further disciplinary action. And I think that a lot of times employers are afraid to make a referral, to set up a performance improvement plan, or to refer to somebody like me, because they fear that, well, if I send them to remedial coaching, that then for the next 6 months they can get away with anything. I even had a client said, well, the problem with my, I had suggested that I work with this person for I think 9 to 12 months for a variety of reasons. And they said, well, I don't know if we're going to go with that, because we can't wait 9 months for her to improve her behavior. No, the behavior is supposed to improve immediately. They're supposed to gain insight over the next few months as to what contributed to it. So that's just something I wanted to throw in there.
Okay. Continuing on with intervention or investigation, what else do you as the HR professional, or you who is the unbiased person conducting this investigation, need to do? One of those things is to gather collateral information. Look at your handbook, your policies. Look at, obtain written statements from witnesses. Look at email correspondence. Take a look at the employee's personnel file. What does it show you? What does it show you as far as the employee's performance evaluations? What does it show you about any other similar complaints that have been filed against this person in the past? What do you know about their background? What about other things going on in their personal life? That can be the collateral information that you learn from the witness statements and witness interviews. Consult with relevant third parties. If you have a general counsel, an in-house attorney, if you have another attorney, a private practice attorney, an employment attorney who you consult with, contact them. Make sure you are speaking to your HR professionals who probably have had some kind of experience with a disruptive professional, either at your current workplace or at their prior workplace. And you also want to get insight from the board of directors. What have they seen? What do they know? Is the behavior, can it be tolerated? Is it a violation of the you know, policies that the board of directors understand. Also, it's a good idea to bring in a consultant or an evaluator, a disinterested, objective, neutral, organizationally and clinically focused person. So, for example, seek guidance from a industrial and organizational psychologist, a clinical psychologist, an attorney, a business consultant. You want to get their insight, particularly from someone like Dr. Haidt, who could say, you know, I have had this experience with this type of person with these types of issues, and I have seen success. Or maybe he would say, you know, if you go back to the anger slide, you know, this person is, you know, off the charts, and they might need more extreme type of counseling, and a workplace is not appropriate for them at this point.
Sure, exactly. And there are some people where that's a recommendation.
Mm-hmm. As Dr. Haidt mentioned earlier, you want to give the employee, the accused, an opportunity to respond and correct his or her behavior. Have a sit-down. Have a casual sit-down conversation where you bring up the accusations that have been brought to your attention, discuss the ramifications of this continued type of behavior, what it means for them personally, what it means for the organization, what it means for financials of the company. Are we losing sales because this person has such a high turnover of a sales force because they are just too, you know, they yell too much.
Right.
They never give praise and thanks where that's due. I mean, oftentimes there are so many studies you'll see where employees just want to be thanked. They just want to be appreciated. It's not always necessarily about how much money they're getting. They want to be appreciated. They want to like where they're working.
And feel valued, right.
And feel valued. And sometimes it's just bringing to that disruptive person's attention what's going on and how people are feeling, and that changes need to be made or else. And, you know, I even was dealing with a situation recently where I was able to sit down with that disruptive professional, explain what the problem was, as was reported, and said, what do you think we should do? How do you propose we should resolve this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, use ultimatums judiciously. Don't make a threat to terminate if it happens again and then not follow through. Be fair. Again, similar to the bullet point above, discuss the ramifications of future violations. What will happen? And this doesn't necessarily mean automatic termination. It could mean a demotion. It could mean transfer. It could mean maybe having a salary decrease and less responsibility because you're no longer a manager or you're no longer supervising this same team that you've been responsible for.
Yeah, and you know, oftentimes I'll say with the ultimatums issue is, you know, it's a similar thing that you'd say to a parent, you know, or that I'd say to a parent when I'm doing couples therapy, is that it's fine to draw the line in the sand. Just know that wherever you draw that line, that you're willing to hold to that line. Because once you draw a line in the sand and then your kid steps over, and they don't get the anticipated consequence, they know that they need to keep stepping forward, or they know that they and get away with it, that they can at least. And we can apply the same logic to an employee. That if you do this one more time, as in they do, and you don't follow through on what the if-then was, then you're just asking for continued trouble.
I hope my husband didn't hear that one. Okay.
Okay, so before I mentioned that it's helpful to think about the compassion, collegiality, and shared goals, and this is just kind of a graphical way of thinking about this. Is with the individual in the middle, what affects the individual affects the company. What affects the company affects the individual. Going up, what affects the individual affects the customer. What affects the customer affects the company, which affects the industry. All of these factors affect one another. And so when we're dealing with one individual and their behavior, their disruptive behavior and their behavior that's being remedied, we need to think about the implications. We need to of that behavior. If it continues, we need to think about what it would cost all of these parties if you terminate the person, because as we mentioned, there are great costs associated with that. Or what could the changed behavior, how could that benefit the other factors or the other entities in this slide? And ultimately, we're trying to balance, I guess, all 5 of these balls, juggle all 5 of these balls, and look at everybody's best interest.
Let me ask you a question. Can remedial coaching or psychotherapy be an effective alternative to discipline or discharge? And in answering that question, can you define what remedial coaching is? Because I'm sure you do that in your practice.
Right. This is actually a big part of my practice, and this is why this is an interest of a topic of interest to me. Essentially, what happens is, after going through that investigation process, after consulting with general counsel and human resources, all that kind of thing, an employer or their attorney or somebody will contact me and say, okay, we've got this employee, whether it's a physician or a CFO or a line worker, whatever. And we want this person to stop doing what they're doing. We want them to better understand what's going on. And so what I do is I call it remedial coaching. Everyone's heard the term executive coaching, and the problem with executive coaching is that it's really not a regulated field, like psychology, for example. This isn't really psychotherapy, although sometimes it can feel like psychotherapy, it can feel like executive coaching. That's why I call it remedial coaching, because what we're really doing is, in contrast to executive coaching, which is looking to optimize peak performance, we're looking to remedy a problem, to change a behavior, to change a problematic behavior. And to answer the question, yes, I think that it can oftentimes be a very effective alternative if it's handled properly, meaning that if the person truly understands what the consequences will be if they don't engage fully in the process, what happens if they, what the implications will be if they engage in the process with me perhaps, but don't change their behavior. And as I mentioned before, I think it's really important that the referring client, the company, understand that this is a developmental process. We're basically learning new ways of being in the workplace, and that's going to take a while. So oftentimes in my recommendations after I do an initial evaluation is I will I'll say that these behaviors shouldn't be tolerated. However, in the same way as when you think of someone who has an alcohol dependency problem, someone who's an alcoholic, we expect that people who are recovering from alcoholism will have relapses from time to time. We don't want it to happen. When it happens, it's tragic and it's very disruptive, but we know that it's likely to happen at some point, and we prepare ourselves for it. And instead of beating the person up over their relapse on alcohol, we say, okay, well, what can be learned from this? So, same thing, we can apply that same concept to disruptive behavior. We can expect that after the initial kind of walking on eggshells, hypervigilance phase that a person goes through when they're going through this process, the first few months even, they're going to finally, their hypervigilance will start to fatigue, they'll start to relax, and their old behaviors are likely to start to creep in a bit. That's why I like to work with people for more than 3 sessions, for more than 3 or 6 months. I generally like to work with somebody, I don't do this with everyone, but I like to work with people in general for about a full year, because it gives us an opportunity for the person to get over their shame and embarrassment, to understand what's going on, to develop insights, to relax a bit, and then apply the insights, and to be humbled by the process when, even with the insights, they start to relapse a bit. And then they're in kind of a safe situation, meaning that they're coming to see me in 2 days, and they can then talk about how I yelled at somebody at work and I felt horribly after it. What do I do to clean up the mess? I didn't get in trouble, but I caught myself.
Do you ever find that remedial coaching or psychotherapy can have maybe just some short-term success and not long-term success, even after, say, a full year of counseling? Meaning,
can people return to their old behaviors after the full workup kind of thing?
Yes.
Of course. There are no guarantees here. And again, using the analogy of the person with an alcoholism problem, you know, I've worked with folks. Again, alcohol and drug abuse is not really my area of expertise, but I have worked with a fair amount of people who, after 5, 10, 15 years of being totally clean and sober, they've slipped.
Mm-hmm.
And so surely slips or mistakes can happen, and true relapses can too as well.
Mm-hmm. And then the other question we had is, what can I do if the problematic disruptive behaviors persist during the remedial coaching or therapy process?
Right, and before we talked about during a that being referred to somebody or being on a PIP doesn't protect them from further discipline. Continued progressive discipline needs to occur, and it needs to occur with some understanding that the person is going through this remedial process, but you don't need to tolerate continued disruptive behavior just because you've referred somebody for this remedial coaching.
And I can say on the flip side of that, looking at the employee who filed the complaint against a disruptive professional, that also doesn't give that employee kind of a free rein to maybe start coming in late or not doing her job.
Exactly.
Not making sales calls, not attending meetings. It doesn't mean that just because you filed a complaint against someone, and even if it's, of course, a legitimate complaint, it doesn't mean you're off the hook because you've tattled on somebody and now you can get off scot-free with not doing your work.
Exactly.
So as progressive discipline applies to the disruptive professional, it also applies to the person who filed the complaint as well.
One thing I'll add about that is that sometimes I've seen, from time to time in different companies, they will refer the person either to the EAP or to somebody like me, and then they feel like they've dumped the problem. It's out of my hands. I don't have to deal with it anymore. Dr. Height's dealing with it, so if the person does something, I'm not going to deal with it. And you couldn't do much worse than doing that. You need to stay in touch. In fact, again, another one of my almost standard recommendations is that the disruptive employee and their supervisor or boss, whatever, that they have regular ongoing meetings so that they can catch behaviors or catch trends, sliding back trends early before the person has gotten themselves into a situation where progressive disciplinary action has to happen.
So when you're in the process of providing remedial coaching, how often do you report back to the company about the progress?
It depends. It depends on what we negotiate up front. One thing that I will say is that obviously I need to maintain some level of privacy, if not confidentiality, on the part of the subject of the consultation, the disruptive person. But ultimately, my client is the company. The company, the law firm, or whomever it is that engaged me in this consultative process, they're my client, and I have a duty to them, but I have a split duty to the employee as well. So I make sure that I'm in touch with my client on a regular basis, the company or the lawyer, whomever, and I also welcome feedback from them way more frequently than I will reach out to them. If they have a question, I'm an email away. I'm a phone call away. If they have a concern, even better. If they have a feeling that the employee's starting to slip a bit, they haven't done anything, but they look grumpy, call me. I'd rather have that data than not. And then I can use that in my work, in this remedial coaching work.
Great. Well, let's ask you all. Have you ever recommended coaching or counseling for a disruptive professional in your current or former workplace? Maybe some of you who say no didn't know that this was an option. So we have some results coming in. Only 3% so far have said this has not been applicable to you. And more results are coming in. It looks like
Starting to even out.
Yeah, starting to even out a little bit. Looks like 56% of you said yes, you have made such a recommendation. 41% of you said no. And for those of you who recommended coaching or counseling for a disruptive professional at your current or former workplace, what contributed or or detracted from its success. If you could take a few minutes and type in your response in the question bar, we certainly would be happy to read a few of those. But in the meantime, I had so many more questions for Dr. Haidt, and there are a few more questions that have come on. Let's see. One of the questions is, can you talk a little about how identifying a psychological or mental issue may run the company afoul of the ADA? Did you want to take that one, or do you want me to take that one?
So it's probably a better question for you, but I'll tell you my response. And my response is that you don't want to identify a psychological or mental issue. Again, I mentioned before that I work with a lot of physicians. I worked at Hopkins for a decade, and oftentimes the chairman or the residency director, who is a physician, who's a healthcare practitioner, would refer and say, yeah, I think this person's depressed, or I think this person might be manic, and I'd say, stop. Describe what you mean by depression, but don't label it as depression. That's a diagnosis. You don't want to go there. Do you want to mention a little bit of why?
Yeah, I mean, I think that helps. I mean, once you label someone with a disability, then the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, may come into play. So even under the ADA, someone doesn't even have to have a diagnosis per se. They can just have be perceived as having a disability, and then they are covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, so as Dr. Haidt said, to label that person could be problematic. So better to just describe the behaviors and then see if you can change those challenging behaviors in the workforce. So I hope that's answered your questions.
Well, one question is just, can we email the attendees a copy of the presentation? And Laura mentioned at the very beginning that the whole presentation will be archived on her website.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It'll be at www.offitkerman.com, and actually, if you just wanted to go into Google and type "Legal Lunch with Laura," it would come up. So that's how I found my own old archived webinars. So we have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask Dr. Haidt some additional questions that have come in through you. And let me see. Dr. Haidt, have you noticed any trends or commonalities among the referrals you received over the years?
Yeah, I think the two trends that are most striking to me, and it took me probably about 15 years of doing this work to notice the first trend, I'm a slow learner perhaps, is that almost all the folks who were referred to me were the brightest in their field, the invaluable people. That this person is a leader in his field in medicine. This person won a prize in whatever, and I'm thinking, wow, so there must be an association between disruptive behavior and being really smart and being really talented. And like I said, I laugh about it because I think it took me all these years to realize, no, it wasn't that. It's that the people who weren't invaluable were let go of. Were probably dealt with differently. And the folks who truly are valuable, you don't want to lose them. You put them through this process, and you hope for the best. Not just as a crapshoot, but you invest in the person. And so that was one trend. The other big trend, and again I mentioned it before, is that compulsivity issue, that perfectionism. I have high standards. Again, I'll use a medical example just because so many of my patients are physicians. I have very high standards as a physician, and I expect everybody else in the OR or everybody else in the clinic to have the same. And when insert your profession here, when a nurse, when a tech, when a whatever comes in and does something, it isn't at my standard, I can't tolerate that because there are patient safety implications. Well, yeah, there really are. And so that's a tough one to deal with until I start to learn about where the compulsivity plays out in this person's life outside of the OR or outside of the clinic or outside of the office. And then I can demonstrate to them how the compulsivity is the problem, their perfectionism is the problem, and that can be dealt with.
I do want to ask you one final question. And first of all, thank you for
my pleasure.
joining me today.
Yeah.
I hope all of you listening have received some good insight and some helpful information. And I do know that you also do corporate consulting.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that would include?
Sure. I mean, a lot of it includes this. So dealing with disruptive folks, dealing with, so I'll consult to the general counsel, I'll consult to HR professionals or managers on how to deal with the disruptive employee. I'll also deal with the disruptive employee myself by doing this remedial coaching. So that's a huge part of it. I also do things like fitness for duty evaluations when there's a history of a psychiatric issue or something like that. There, somebody has raised an issue, a disability, and they want to see if the person is fit for duty. Someone has been out of work for a while, or also workplace violence. That's actually I think how we met. You heard me talk about workplace violence one time.
That's right. So
I do workplace violence risk assessment evaluations. I also do executive selection. So when somebody's looking to hire somebody, or even better, when they're looking to move somebody within their organization up, and they want to know what will this, what type of position will this person fit into, better or worse. I can do some help there. What else? I do training, I do retreat facilitation sometimes, coaching, and then I also do forensic work, which is really kind of outside of kind of the scope of what we've been talking about today.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I enjoyed having you talk about your area of expertise. If anyone has any questions, feel free to contact Dr. Height directly. His email address is michael@heitt, HEITTC3.com. Or if you have any questions for me, feel free to contact me at lrubenstein@othickerman.com. Thank you again for your participation, and I look forward to having you participate again on Tuesday, September 18th. Thank you.